I'm sure there have been days like this, right? People reading newspapers. Now, when you travel by bus, by train, or when you're overseas, very rarely you see people reading a physical newspaper. Am I right to say that? Now, everything is like this. Everything is on a smartphone or a device, a laptop, and everything is revolving around applications. So today our life is revolving around applications from the time we wake up, right? You have an alarm which goes off to wake you up, an alarm which says you need to drink water, an app to say that you need to drink water, or an app to say that you need to eat, to the extent where you even manage various aspects of your product development using various applications. So when you look at the ecosystem, mobility is becoming the key word or the key factor which every organization is talking about as part of their digitization strategy. So there are three aspects. One, from a user perspective, technology, and the business. And typically, you're looking at more high-speed or cheaper technology which is being made available, which is accelerating the growth of application development. If you go back 10 years ago, we were predominantly talking about client-server environment, and today it's not the case. You can develop mobile app, and within a few hours you can have an app readily available, launched in production. Right? So the speed at which the developments have taken place, or the speed at which the organizations are rolling out services, have phenomenally accelerated the speed at which they reach out to the customers. And today, if you don't have a web presence or a mobile presence, you probably are not competitive enough. If you look at the cab services, no more calling on the phone anymore, isn't it? Right? So you have the Ubers, the Olas, and various other cab companies. They have apps. You download them, and then you are able to get services immediately. And likewise, your customers may also be looking at different applications to enable services for their own customers, or to take services and products to their customers. So there are a couple of aspects which we need to look at. Now, when we look at mobility, a lot of people think, okay, everything should be on a smartphone, or everything which can be accessed from anywhere in the world. So how do you allow? Now, today, if you look at, there are things which you use, emails, or if you look at the mobilization process, you're talking about B2B, business to business, or business to the government or the consumer. Now, for example, the eBays, the Amazons. Right? While the services are being enabled, you're also expected to ensure there is a sufficient amount of security built into this whole process. People who are concerned about security in many organizations could be very, very little, in the sense until something really goes wrong, people are not going to be talking about security. And today what people always say is, okay, is the app ready? Is the product ready? Can we launch it? And when something goes wrong, people come back and say, hey, what's happened to us? What's going on? Can we just start looking at what's the root cause? So today organizations have started looking at, from a line of business to end users, how well is the security built into it. Mobile phones, or the mobile attacks, or mobile becomes the number one attack factor globally, This is rated as number 1. So smartphones in which you have your corporate application becomes the gateway. Now let me give you a couple of examples. Now when you download an application from the Google Store or an iStore or any website, what permissions do you grant your application? Typically they ask access to your contacts, isn't it? They ask access to your camera, they ask access to your microphone, they ask access to your the image folders, the photographs. Now typically that's probably what you would be also doing when you develop your applications. You probably start asking access to these information. Now here comes the challenge, right? There are applications. Now for example, we came across when we were doing an audit, we found that this particular user had installed an Ola application to order cabs. Now this particular application was asking for the user's browsing habits. Now how can a user's browsing habit be useful for a cab company? Now if you're using a web application to access corporate information or systems, those history is also going to be there, isn't it? Now, when a third-party application is going to start accessing all this information, your security can be also at risk. So these are few statistics which you have right now, right? I mean, more than 15 billion apps which you can download from different stores. So when you look at from a security risk perspective, there's a gamut of things which you're looking at, right? So there are malware to network and system abuse. But you don't really see application as one of the items, but that's what we are saying is the core of the issue. Now, for example, if somebody wants to attack a network, they probably attack a firewall. But if there is a vulnerability in an application, they really don't have to worry about attacking a firewall. They just exploit the code. They can go directly into the database. For example, maybe an SQL injection. Now, likewise, when you have your own applications which are developed and installed on a device, there could be spywares which are also running on the same device. And typically, they can be looking at information which is very, very sensitive. For example, you use phone calls or you make app-based calls. Those calls can be also tracked, or people can be listening into those conversations, SMS. Right? So, going further up, just want to focus on this particular situation, right? Here's an app which was launched during the Obamacare when it was launched in 2010. And this particular website was hacked. What was the impact? So the impact of this particular application being vulnerable, they lost all the patient-related or the people who had subscribed for the Obamacare lost all their details. Now that's a concern, right? So likewise, there could be different applications which have different sets of data. Now, for example, recently we also had a situation in Sri Lanka where the president's website was hacked, right? So before that, there were a couple of government websites hacked, including the various departmental sites. So did we lose information? Now, there could be various other organizational websites being hacked, which is probably used as a medium to transact business, right? So Target was a large supermarket chain which was hacked, and a lot of credit card details were stolen. And subsequently, the retail sector globally started tightening the security. And today, what's happening around the world is when the hackers know that people like the banks and the retail sector are tightening the security, they are looking at other industries or other sectors where they can focus their attention. Now, there could be applications which are developed for the leisure sector, healthcare sector. Right? So there could be mobile application focused on those industries. So the hackers actually start targeting those industries and the applications which are being used in those areas. This chart actually tells you what are the different types of attacks which are possible in a typical application domain. And if you look at the timelines, starting from the 1980s to 2000 until now, all these things which are out there still exist. The only difference is today, people really don't need to have much knowledge. There are several tools which they can make use of to launch an attack. So the capability in terms of a hacker is far superior in terms of use of those tools. So if you look at the things which they do, now for example, cross-site scripting, or even if you look at spoofing, sniffers, all these different techniques can be used by the hackers to launch an attack. Today, all listed companies in the US, they expect the listed companies to declare any security breach which has happened in that organization. Which also means, like when the accounting data are released, they usually have one column which talks about fraud-related activities. Now, going forward, the rest of the world will also follow this model where whenever there is a cyber breach which happens, that needs to be disclosed if it is a listed company. So the issue becomes serious if it is an application which was the root cause for a attack or a breach. Similarly, if you look at these different organizations, the rating agencies, right? The credit rating agencies will also rate the credit rating based on the performance of the organization. And typically when you look at the cyber crimes or the cyber incidents which take place globally, the record or the information which we have right now, they say typically a hacker is on the network for about 180 days. But when you look at the statistics for this part of the world, the Asian region, they have been on the network for more than 500 days. So which also means that the longer they stay, the more damage they could be performing. Now, when you look at security in an organization or a product which you develop, typically how much money gets allocated for application security budgets? Now, most of the time when you look at an organization's security budget, 90% of the budget goes for network security. They would spend more money in terms of putting a firewall or anything related to the network. Less than 10% or less than 20% of the money gets allocated for application security. Now, for example, application audits, security audits, or application security related technology. Now, for example, web application firewalls and so on and so forth don't really come into the focus. So typically, when you have less money, less training, less budgets, this is what actually could happen. I mean, you probably would have seen as part of the project management trainings, you would have seen those images which talks about customer's requirement, how he visualizes a product, and eventually what a product is delivered to. And here, this is what you see in terms of what the building is, what was planned, and what is a functional requirement. And then sometimes there are applications, there are functions which are not used or could not be used, and then people start building certain things as an afterthought. That's what happens in a typical product development or before you actually deliver, right? So what you plan and what you deliver are totally two different things. So whose fault is it anyway? Is it your fault or is the business's fault? So that's what we're trying to understand here. So when you look at an application design, that's the stuff which the application is supposed to do. And what you have here outside the Venn diagram, right? So it is the functional bugs. Then the developed application is in the blue, and that introduces the security vulnerabilities. Now I'm sure most of you would recognize this issue, but that's what was actually expected to be done. So whatever is in excess outside of that on the left or on the right introduces either a functional bug or a security issue. And finally, you end up here with the customer expected a shark, but then you develop a goldfin and then you put a tail, right? So eventually you have a design flaw which sometimes can lead to a security vulnerability or a product failure itself. Today, we are not just talking about mobile applications. We are talking about Internet of Things, connected devices. And all these devices have a piece of code running in it, isn't it? And some of you may even be developing applications which are going to be run in each of these devices. Now, I have some of the clients who actually have embedded applications in some of the devices which are running. And recently, there was an attack on a particular website. This website was of a security researcher who had been doing some research on some hackers. And eventually, the hackers were arrested, 2 of them. So the hacking community got together and they said that they will target this particular person's website, and they started attacking his website. A security organization, they said, okay, we will come in and help you to defend your asset, which is the website. Now, over a period of time, they started pumping in traffic which was like 250 GB or more, at which point in time, the security agency said that they will stop supporting, they withdrew. Now, what did they make use to generate that traffic? They made use of all the Internet of Things, all those devices which are out there, the vulnerabilities existing in each of those devices or the apps, and they started attacking that particular website. Right? So earlier it used to be a single device, single application which gets targeted, but today they can harness all the applications in the world and target a particular company or a website. Now the challenge is when investigators come in, they're probably going to ask which application attacked who. And most of the time it might be pointing back to some of the products which probably was used, or it could have been developed by any one of us. So this becomes the biggest challenge for us. So when you look at the mobility aspects, right? Now, we are just moving, right? I mean, there is a need, and immediately there is a solution. So you're looking at the trends, you start developing applications, and you start launching them, right? So And most of the time, security is just an afterthought. So the challenges for the enterprise is, if it is a device, if it is something to do with network, the security is always thought of. But when it is an application, it is never thought of. Now, for example, when you build a house, you probably will think where you would want to keep the windows. You would also start thinking where you would want to keep the doors. And you would also probably decide on the type of locks which you would want to have. But when we build applications, do we give thought to ask, do we need security? Or what level of security do we need to have? Right? So that becomes the major challenge. And typically when you start looking at an application, it has to capture data or process data. So the level of security which you need to build in, it is going to predominantly based on the data which is going to be either captured or processed or used in that application. Now, when we go to an organization and ask what you need to secure, they will talk about all these things. They will say we need to take a device, we should be able to monitor it remotely, we should be able to lock it down, we need to encrypt, and all these things. But do you see applications anywhere in this? And very often we will never see the applications coming into play, because most of the time there is a challenge. Sorry, let me go this way. They will talk about security policies. They will talk about authentication. They will talk about secure connection. They'll talk about encryption. They'll talk about creating awareness. They will also talking about monitoring. But the security of applications will never be thought. So that's where the missing link is. That's what I'm going to tell you next in terms of what you should be doing. So when you look at application development landscape, these are all the people who are probably the stakeholders. Do you agree with me? Right? All these people. Now, who in this lot should be talking about security? I'd like to hear from you. Who in this lot should be talking about security? Of course, there is a security specialist there. Everybody should be talking about it, absolutely. But if you look around to several other companies, I'm sure your company probably you're doing it, but then the other companies or the other organizations, they may not be talking about security. Now, so typically we come across situations, product is developed, given, a maintenance agreement is signed, a couple of years later or a year later, there are patches released by PHP, for example, let's say, and that is never applied. Or when you reach out to the development company, they would say that is not covered as part of a maintenance agreement. So if we were to apply this patch, some of the functionalities may not work. Do we come across that situation? Right? So I think it is good for us to talk about it up front, saying this is what we would do as part of a product development. These things as part of security will be covered, but anything which is going to happen subsequently, we would have to take at an additional cost. Now, for example, I'm sure all of you are using a smartphone. If you're using an Android phone, what is your operating system right now? How many of you are using marshmallows? Anyone marshmallows? Lollipop? Show of hands, please, so that I can relate to what I'm trying to say. Anyone using Lollipop?
There's just iPhone users here.
All iPhone? All iPhone? iPhone 7? iPhone 6? Oh, this one. So all the others, iPhone 5. So that's the challenge, isn't it? On one side, the technology is growing. On the other side, you are not able to cope up with that. And then there are vulnerabilities which are identified which may not be patched. Right? So that's going to be an eternal issue. So the challenge here is, if you don't have a security specialist, who will initiate the discussion about information security or security of your product? Who should? From this list. Top management, yes, of course, that's where the governance and the oversight comes in. But amongst the other people, who should be actively looking at security at the initial stage? Now, there are two sides to it, right? If you are an organization, you are going to deploy an application in your organization, definitely the top management support is essential. But if you are a development company, you are talking to me as a customer, who on your side should be talking about security to me? Because I may not know what I need to secure, or I may not be in a position to articulate my needs. Right, there's an answer here, developers, and somebody else whispered something from this. Business owner, yes, business owner, ideally he should be able to say, but he would not be able to articulate. But let's say if you're a developer, or you're a development company, you're approaching a new customer about a new product deployment or development, who should be talking about security? Let me tell you. I'm sure the business analysts are the people who would actually start engaging with the customer first. Am I right to say that? What will the business analysts do? Identify the requirements, isn't it? They come up and say, okay, we need an application. The application should be able to do billing or be able to track the leave applications, whatever. Now, when you start looking at the requirement, one aspect you need to be looking at is the data. Now, when you look at the data, what data is sensitive? Which data should be kept confidential? Which data should be kept in integrity? And how will you keep the data available all the time? Now, there could be certain data sets which are confidential, isn't it? Or sometimes you're talking about privacy, personally identifiable information. Now, based on the information you're trying to collect, process, your level of security has to be brought in. Now, again, applications have to be authenticated. Like you need to have a username and a password. Now, what is the best way to create a username and a password? Or what is the best way to create passwords? Who decides on that? The business analyst? Or the design people, the technical design guys, or the technical architects, or the developers? Just a few thoughts, few things for you to reflect and ask these questions. Now, if you leave it to the developers, they know, okay, I have a username, I need to use something to get the application to work or have access into the application. But how do you capture that information and store it in your database? Let's say if the password is password 123, if I go to the database table, what should I be seeing? Should I be able to see password 123 in the table? Or should it be, what should it be? Encrypted. Or should it be hashed? Right? So that's where the challenge comes in, right? So that's a subtle difference. And definitely they are not the same. Encryption is not equal to hashing. When you say encryption, it is two ways. You take clear text, you garble it and you store it, and using the same key, you should be able to do the reverse. So you get the clear text. But when you hash, it's like your scrambled eggs. One-way process. So you can make scrambled eggs. From scrambled eggs, you can't make the eggs back again, right? But that's how they were doing it until 2010, 2012, until LinkedIn got hacked. And LinkedIn did not use a token or random token along with hash. So when I look at this simple example, who should be coming up with all these requirements? Customer? Senior management? Who should be doing it? That's my question. Right? So certain things I think has to be done by the business analyst, and maybe if you have a framework which clearly says, if it is passwords, this is how you develop. So when you hire a new guy, let's say you hire me to work in your team, and you say, this is my framework, this is how I expect you to have the password coded. And when it goes to the QA team, the quality team, they know exactly what to test. If we don't define that, everybody would start doing their own thing. Functionally, it will work, like how you saw in my earlier slides. But in terms of keeping it secure, it may not be secure, right? So you probably will have all these people, quality assurance, and maybe client-side project managers as well, because client-side project managers will be more interested in terms of, are you delivering on time? There should be no slip-up on the deliveries. Do you do use cases as part of your development? Do you do misuse cases? That's where the challenge is, right? So it's easier to say 1 + 1 is 2 than the other way around, right? You should be able to say 1 + 1 cannot be 3, 1 + 1 cannot be greater than this or less than this. And we are all made that way. The way we think, the way we start looking at things or the processes, we look at in a very logical way. And I'm sure you as programmers, you would also think more in those lines. And the bad guys also know how you think. Now recently I was at an audit, and we were talking about passwords. So one guy was in one side of the room, the other guy was on the other side of the room, and they had to authenticate me for me to perform an audit. So now this guy says, can you come down and insert the password? And that guy says, no, it's that dog, right? Since you may not understand Sinhala, so I'm just translating it, right? He said, this is the dog, the Balpatia. So he typed the password and he goes up. I say, authentication error. Then the guy comes back and says, he looks at the thing, no, this is not the dog, this is dog's mother. Right? So in 45 minutes, listening to their conversation, I asked them, is your password Tommy? They said, yes, that's the dog's name. Right? So the bad guys, the hackers, they also know how we think. And they always start doing things that way. Logically, they will be doing what you would be doing. And we would think that nobody would know. Right? So that's what it is. So when you look at the use cases or the misuse cases, you need to start looking at these areas. I've listed down a few things. Access sensitive or restricted information. Now, for you to come up with misuse cases or even the use cases, you should be able to identify what is sensitive information or confidential information. If that information is not provided to you, or if you have not asked the customer, there is no way you're going to know about it, isn't it? Am I right to say that? Same way, gain free access or to the otherwise paid for content. Spy on users' web browsing habits. Looking at user behavior, user experience, you can always find out what he's looking for. We had another example in Bangalore. We were doing an audit for a multinational, and they wanted us to do an audit on RESTful technology. So they were going to use RESTful technology, wanted us to do an audit. And before we go into the audit, we also try and do a little bit of research in terms of understanding what this was. I mean, this was the initial stage, about three years ago. And I accidentally stumbled into a group where they were discussing about it. Now, went through it, and there were a lot of things which they were talking about, very valuable information. I arrive at the client site, and they start talking about few of the things which they had actually discussed in the forum. So when they when they talked about the first two, I then told them, do you have this issue? Do you have this issue? Do you have this issue? And they said, yes, how do you know? They were not using their own names. That was the good thing. But, in some places you could actually connect the dot. So when you're looking at whatever you search, whatever you surf, or whatever you seek after, some information you need to be conscious of, right? Do you do threat modeling? This is the model adopted by Microsoft. If you're predominantly using Microsoft, then maybe you can look at this model as well. So they talk about these steps, like trying to identify the assets, create an architecture overview, decompose the application, identify the threats, document the threats, and document the vulnerabilities. So they talk about a method called STRIDE. Can you spoof your user's identity? Or can you tamper? Can you find privacy-related information or confidential information? Or can you escalate the privileges? Now, this is where you need to equip the capabilities or the ability of the QA team to perform all those testing. So it should be pre-documented, the use cases for positive testing and also the abuse cases or the misuse cases, so that the QA team can run through those checks again and again and clearly reproduce those issues and tell the programmers what the issue is. Do you all do risk assessment as part of your development methodology? So if you're not doing it, you can actually use this model for your risk assessment. So if you go to the Microsoft site, they have ample details on that. Right? I'm not by any means promoting Microsoft, but I thought it's a good reference point. So when I summarize the threat model, this is what it would be. If you look at your SDLC life cycle, when you do your requirements and your design, that's where you would look at your threats. So when you know that you're going to have sensitive data or healthcare related data, for example, then who would be interested in that information? How would they access it? Who will access? All that information is done. Then when you get into the implementation, you do a security code review. In terms of verification, you do penetration testing. And then when you come to the maintenance part, you do patch management. So you patch your application for vulnerabilities you identify. So that's exactly what your typical SDLC lifecycle would be, but you might be using Agile and various methods. But in essence, you would definitely have this, right? You will not have any method without any one of these. So I have a few slides which talks about what happens in each of those stages, and I've just listed down on the other side what typically you should be looking at from a security perspective. Now, if you need the slides are here on this machine. You can actually share it with them. I have no problems with that, right? So you may want to, take this and improve on your framework. So when you talk about the security control for the requirements gathering, you need to also understand what are the different policies your customers have from a security perspective. And you need to have an understanding of it. Only when you understand what they do as part of security, then you can inbuild those things into your product. If, let's say, the customer doesn't have a policy, are you in a position to advise them and say, this is what we do in our product development to address security? The other important aspect is the regulatory and the legal requirement. Now, some applications, some regulatory requirements would say that you need to maintain an audit log of every transaction. And that is a given for any country. But the only difference would be how long are you expected to keep those audit logs, either online or even offline. But today, sometimes when we go in for audits, several applications don't even have an audit log. That feature is not even there. And sometimes when we ask, why don't you have it? They say, oh, there's no space to store it. Right? So if, let's say, legally, if you're supposed to have an investigation or provide evidence of any activity, then you need to have that identified. Recently, we came across another situation in another organization where somebody had applied for leave. So when the person applied for leave, the application just said leave authorized in the absence of the authorized. So the person went on leave. When the person came back, he was asked, why have you not been at work? He said, I applied for leave, my leave was approved, and hence I went on leave. And the person produced an email to say that his or her email was actually authorized. So when they approached the authorizer or the reporting supervisor, he said, no, I never authorized it. How did it happen? So this particular person found a vulnerability in the application, exploited, got in there and changed the flag. And then went on leave. Now the question is, how many such occurrences have had happened since they deployed it? Because this is a new implementation, about 6 months in operation. But apparently they found that there's so many other people have also taken time off, unauthorized, which also means they can go on leave. So in case somebody asks, I've taken leave, they can show a record and say this is what you authorized. So they can actually get away with that. But in some cases, they could have gone on leave, come back and reverse the flag. So their leave count will still be at the same levels. Right? So you need to understand in terms of the requirements, identify the privacy requirements. CIA. So CIA are the 3 tenets on which the information security is built: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you need to identify what data is going to be confidential, where you need to ensure integrity, where you need to ensure the data is available whenever it is required. Right? Then at the design stage, that's what you would be doing, right? Use and abuse case modeling. Now some use cases can be repeated for various applications, but some could be very, very specific to that particular application. So you may want to build a dictionary or an inventory of those use cases and misuse cases, and that's going to make your application more robust. Right? Then we talked about risk modeling, and you're talking about the test cases. Now, for me, typically the users, the end users will create user acceptance cases, right? Test cases for user acceptance. But security test cases should also be part of it. That's my suggestion, right? So in the development, you start writing secure code. And one of the best way to do that, once you write your code, you could get one of your colleagues to do a peer review. Where the QA team may not have the time, because you would be going at the 11th hour to the QA team, please do the review, we need to go live tomorrow. They may not have the time. So it might be a good idea for your peers, your colleagues to do a code review. And it also becomes a training opportunity, isn't it? Because some people might write In 5 steps, some people might take 50 steps and write the same thing, achieve the same objective. So there might be pros, there might be cons, but then the people can learn. Then comes the security testing. You do a reassessment, and then you get into the deployment, where you harden your application. Sometimes we come across situations where application is developed on a vulnerable system. When I say vulnerable, the latest patches are not applied, not installed. And the code is developed on that, and the moment the systems are patched, the application stops working. Right? So it's important that you harden your operating system and develop on that bed. So when you get into the maintenance phase, ensure there is a proper change request, change management process. And a lot of time changes come through emails or on a phone call. Right? So those have to be managed as well. And eventually, this is one part which people don't look at it at all, the disposal part of it. So you need to ensure the application archiving is taken into consideration, data sanitization, and how you will securely dispose your applications and the data. Then, of course, take the learning back into your development stage again. Right? Summarizing all that, I've just got one slide, so I'm just going to skip this in essence of time. Best practices, right? Few things which you need to understand: the technology, the software, because the hardware is going to have a dependency, and design features, develop software with secure features. All that needs to be inbuilt, right? One last slide, talking about certifications, right? Now, I'm sure all of you specialize in your own technology, whatever you use, like for maybe .NET, Java. But has anyone in this room looked at a security certification for software development? Have you? Anyone? I encourage you to look at that certification there, CSSLP. If you Google for CSSLP, it's a good certification to have. And today, most of the organizations in the US and in Europe, they look at that certification as a a critical success factor to choose a good software vendor. Right? That certification actually tells you what to look for when you build a good secure code. Right? It takes you through the SDLC and tells you what security you need to build into those areas. Right? So coming back in to the same slide again. So can your software be compliant to global standards? How many of you watch motor racing? It's one of the most dangerous sports, isn't it? But do you see accidents very often? Or do you hear of people dying racing? Very rarely. The last time there was an accident was last year in Japan, when Bianchi had a crash due to the rain and bad visibility. Apart from that, very rarely you hear of a person who gets injured driving a Formula One race or in a Formula One track. Now, they do so much of safety tests before they put the car on the track. How much of testing, how much of security do we build into our applications? Right? That's one thought which I want to leave for you. And this is something which I have a feeling will happen at some point in time in the future. When all the other businesses are getting regulated, there might come a time software development and engineering may get regulated. If that gets regulated, how well will you be in a position to survive when that happens? So in order for you to get there, even before it happens, so it's important for you to look at your SDLC and look at the security steps in each of those stages. Start looking at the gaps, address those things, train your people, And then eventually, if let's say it gets regulated, you are there. Right? I know a few financial institutions in Europe. They've clearly said, I mean, tell me how many security certified people you have in your software team. And when you say you don't have one, then they tell you, okay, we give you 6 months, you get the guys trained. And only then we will start doing business with you. So it's happening, and it will get accelerated. And I guess it's time for you to reflect on that and ensure that helps you to build good security into your framework and your products. So with that, I just wrap my presentation. And you've been very nice, very patiently hearing me out. If you have any questions, I'd like to take it before.
Will we get in the future a platform which will take care of this, a lot of these issues, the technical issues related to security, so that the individual developer doesn't have to think about it so much, where keeping your information secure, keeping everything encrypted, doing all the hashing, everything is, you just get a nice framework to work with, and 90% of all of this is taken care of. Do you think that will happen?
That is happening already, right? I mean, a lot of organizations have come up with their own framework, so which becomes even much more simpler to adopt. Now, for example, how do you mitigate SQL injection? And most of the time we find when we do the audit, when it is in the pre-production stage or after it goes into production, we find there's an SQL injection, which could have been prevented at the design stage itself or at the requirement stage. You are saying, okay, this is an input field, it only has to have alpha, which characters to be whitelisted? Which is easier, whitelisting or blacklisting? So you decide based on that, and you build that into your framework, so every time that particular scenario comes into use, you're applying that method there. Right? So that will definitely help you to reduce the time you spend in terms of reworking after your test, or when a client comes back saying, okay, these are vulnerabilities in your application, which is sometimes very unproductive for you, because which valuable time could be used to develop something else. So you definitely save a lot of money out there in terms of time as well. So thank you once again for this opportunity, and you have a great evening. Thank you.